Great. So, welcome to the afternoon session of our conference on psychology. My presentation is on the return of psychedelics. The return because they were... Should I stop?
Oh, never mind, it's fine.
No? It's fine? We're on? Good. Okay. So the return of psychedelics because they were popular and they were in fashion at some point in the Western society, I mean. And then they they were banned for a while, and then they came back. They made a comeback, and it was fairly recent. As I said, the presentation is not heavily technical. It's not very difficult. There are just a few terms which I would challenge myself to pronounce first. But otherwise, it's just a layman version of, of the story, because I'm not an expert, and everything I know about psychedelics is based on research made by other people and books written by other people. And in particular, I'd like to share with you the book by Michael Pollan. So you can have a look at it later on if you're interested. And this was my inspiration behind this presentation. Okay, so I believe that I have about 20 slides. I believe it will be maybe 30 minutes in total, so we'll split it into two parts, 15 minutes and 15 minutes. So I'll just wait for your signal to stop. Okay, so with that, let us begin. So psychedelics. So what are psychedelics? So these psychoactive substances, hallucinogens, that cause visual and audio changes and can alter our state of consciousness. Many of them belong to tryptamines or phenethylamines. For example, LSD, which stands for lysergic acid diethylamide, or mescaline, psilocybin, DMT. So these are names that you certainly have heard, even if you don't know what they mean, what kind of substances they denote. You have certainly heard those terms around. Okay, so first of all, contrary to popular belief, psychedelics are not drugs. Their effect on the human brain is very different from drugs. First of all, they're not addictive, unlike cigarettes or alcohol. People do not become addicted to psychedelics. And this is a very common misconception. People think that if you try it once, then you get hooked. Unlike common drugs such as opioids or cigarettes, the experience that the person goes through is very much dependent on set and setting. And these two concepts are central to this whole notion of psychedelics. Set and settings refer to, so set refers to beliefs, expectations, or certain pre-existing psychological conditions. So for example, the person who takes a dose of psychedelics is expecting a particular kind of trip. And this will determine what kind of experience this person will have. Setting refers to a physical environment, where the person is located, who the person is surrounded with, etc. Another difference is that psychedelics alter consciousness in a qualitative way. So what does this mean? It means that you do have visions, and you do have some, a distorted presentation of reality for a while, but then after the effect of the drug wears off, your perception of the world changes, not in the sense that you're tripping all the time or you're hallucinating for the rest of your life, but in the sense that you perceive things differently, your attitude changes, your perception of the world changes, your psychological attitude changes. And this effect lasts for a long time, or potentially can last for a long time. Another very important thing to remember about psychedelics is that in a controlled environment, for example, when those substances are administered under strict supervision by trained psychologists, negative outcomes are extremely rare. Okay, brief history. Psychedelics have been known to humanity for thousands of years. Those substances were used by ancient cultures around the world for religious and spiritual practices, as well as for therapeutic purposes. For example, in Mexico and Central America, psilocybin was used for those purposes. This is a molecule produced by mushrooms. You must have heard the word magic mushrooms. You know what this is literally a mushroom. Actually, it's a fungus that produces this kind of molecule. The Roman Catholic Church suppressed the use of psychedelics after the Spanish conquest of the continent. And they had very good reasons to, which I will not go into in my presentation. Another example, indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin use the ayahuasca beverage. So it's a beverage, it's a brew that's made with a plant. And it contains DMT, among other ingredients. The beverage is used as a sacrament in spiritual ceremonies. And one story I heard that this is used to summon the spirits of your ancestors. Okay, so this is as far as ancient history goes. What happened in our time, more or less? So first time in 1938, Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD-25 in Switzerland. So he worked in a pharmaceutical company called Sandoz, and the company was working on creating a new drug that would improve blood circulation. So he was one of the people who worked in the lab trying to develop this new drug. So what happened, so he synthesized this substance in the lab, and at the time the substance was dismissed because they did not find any perceivable value. They did not think it was useful for anything they were doing at the time, so it was kind of shelved and forgotten about. But then in 1943, there was a curious accident that remains unexplained how exactly that happened, but he accidentally ingested a small dose of the new substance. So the substance was still kicking around in the lab somewhere, so somehow he got to ingest it. So when he ingested this very small amount, this was probably the first and it was the first trip ever in the history of the Western world. And it was the only trip probably that was not burdened by any expectations. So it was clean in that sense. So the person did not enter this experience with any preconceived notions. It was an accident. And here is how he describes the results, his experience after having accidentally ingested this substance. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. So this was the very first accidental attempt. So what happens after? A few days later, this very respectable scientist actually administers to himself a larger dose on purpose. So he ingested 0.25 milligrams. So a milligram is 1/1000th of a gram of LSD dissolved in a glass of water. And at the time, this would be considered a very, very small dose of any known drug. So he, based on what he knew, he thought this was he was being very reasonable and very careful. But as it turned out later, LSD is one of the most potent psychotropic compounds. And this was a huge dose because now the dose is actually measured in micrograms. 1,000 of a milligram. So what happens next? So this was, so now this was on April 19, 1943. And ever since, all the big fans of psychedelics celebrate April 19th as a bicycle day, because the story goes, and actually according to his own account, he administered this huge dose of LSD to himself and then rode a bike home. And somehow he managed to get home in that state. And what happened after is actually also very interesting, but I'm not going to go into that for considerations of time. Okay, so this was 1943. This was the first experience with this substance. In 1950s, a substantial amount of brain research was conducted. Psychedelics turned out to be promising drugs for treating a variety of mental disorders, such as alcoholism, anxiety, depression, psychosis. But then what happened in the 60s, we all associate with this period, and we're talking about the United States. So it started off in Switzerland, but then the major part of history was taking place in the U.S. So the rise of counterculture in the U.S., and we associate with this part of American history the widespread by young people, the widespread use of LSD among young people in the States. And what happened, essentially, psychedelics escaped the confines of the lab, and they became publicly available to untrained, unprepared people who had no idea what they were dealing with. So if you think about it, Alfred Hoffman, who was a trained scientist who worked in the lab and who made a judgment about the dose, and he was so off. Just imagine what people who have no idea how to handle drugs and how to assess the potency of a particular substance, just imagine what would happen to them. So naturally, panic ensued. And it was caused by extremely bad publicity. There was a flood of news of bad trips, suicides, psychotic episodes. And as a result, in the late 60s, most psychedelics became illegal in the United States as well as worldwide. In the 90s, research resumed. So several universities picked up that subject again and started working on it again. Johns Hopkins University, New York University, UCLA, there were probably some others, but this is just a few examples. Now, I will discuss current research in more detail later on, but for now, this slide completes a very brief history of psychedelics for my purposes here, just to give you a very brief idea of what was going on. Okay, so now the question is, how do psychedelics affect the human mind? First of all, the term psychedelic was coined by the British-American psychiatrist Humphry Osmond in the 50s. According to a story, Humphry Osmond introduced this term in his letter to the writer Aldous Huxley. There were other suggestions, but they were rejected by the community, by the professional community, for various reasons. So the term psychedelic consists of two parts, psyche, soul, and delos, clear. So it comes from the Greek, has two Greek roots. So basically it means your mind becomes clear. Okay, now